My name's James and I paint minis. This is Spoon 37 Minis. So this time we're highlighting the Tyranid Hive Tyrant with Wild Rider Red from the Games Workshop. So we're starting off with the paint quite watered down as always, and we're using a detail brush from the old Games Workshop range, similar to an S layer brush from the current range, although a size 0 brush from almost any paintbrush manufacturer would be similar. Now, one thing that you may notice is this is the most extreme highlight colour I'm going to do on this flesh. This is almost a neon red colour, and it is the brightest colour I'm going to use. And you may feel that this is a bit of a leap from the Army Painter Pure Red, which was the previous highlight colour. Now, this is quite deliberate. What I found with some of my other Tyranids earlier on was I tried this and it was too big a step. And then I got some Evil Sun Scarlet from the Games Workshop, and I painted it between the extreme highlight and the pure red areas, and it looked about right. So I sort of stumbled upon this technique, and I've gone with it for every Tyranid I've done ever since. That having been said, when I've posted some of my other Tyranids on Instagram, some people have suggested using a colour from the Games Workshop called Fire Dragon Bright as a further highlight. I'm not sure about doing this because I'm a bit worried about going too far into the orange rather than keeping it red. The other thing is I haven't actually purchased that paint, so I literally can't try it at the moment. I may try it at some point in the future, so this will be the final highlight on the flesh for now. The Fire Dragon Bright is something I'm aware of and I may try going forwards. Right, so those of you who have watched my previous videos on this model will notice that I'm working in exactly the same order, starting with the left leg, starting with the area around the foot, working up around the ankle area and the lower leg, and then moving on to the part of the leg above that, the sort of mid leg, and then onto the upper leg. It's just working in the same order, which keeps things consistent for me. Unlike the previous steps though, we're only focusing on the absolute peaks, so all of the raised areas, anywhere that's going to be right up against, say, the blackest part of the hoof or the black carapace, for contrast, and then obviously anything that's simply a raised surface or an upper surface, because with this model we're not doing like a strong directional light source, we're just assuming vague general lighting like it's out in daylight. Moving on to the upper thigh, this is where you have to start kind of making it up as you go along, because unlike the lower legs where there are quite obvious ridges and raised areas to pick out, this is more like just a couple of muscles being flexed, so you just have to try and pick out the peaks of where those are and just kind of go with that. I do also apologise for the camera work. This will happen a couple of times where I have to tilt the model away from the camera. It's simply so that I can see the inner thigh. In order to paint it, there's basically two raised areas there that I have to paint, and then I can move on and do other parts of the model. Moving on to the second leg, exactly the same work order, just these the very tips of the flesh above the hoof, and then we'll move on to kind of the ankle and the shin, and then the sort of mid leg above that in exactly the same order. I do this mainly so that I don't forget anything. And whilst it's easy to think that that sounds silly, saying, oh, you know, I do this so I don't forget. The reality is, particularly when you start posting pictures on Instagram or making videos for YouTube, you very quickly notice that you can very easily miss things. You know, you've forgotten to paint the hands on a miniature, or you thought you were done and then there's an area that has no paint on it. So doing this might sound silly, but actually it's really, really useful for consistency. Now, although I am strictly speaking doing this as a layer highlight, you will notice because this is the most extreme highlight, some of what I'm doing here probably counts as edge highlighting. So highlighting around the sort of like excavated area in the back of the mid leg, and then up around the sort of calf muscle, just around the edges. As I say, I will be adding a colour in between this and the previous highlights, which will help blend all that together. Same again with the upper thigh, just trying to figure out which parts of the muscle to pick out, just as the extreme highlight. Obviously any lumps and bumps that stick up have to be highlighted. You will notice that I'm completely omitting the webbing between the sort of hip and the middle of the torso, I guess you'd say. This is because I want there to be a bit of contrast there, so it looks a little bit different. Now moving on to the lower torso, I wasn't sure how much this will show, but there are some sort of vertical lines going up either side of the narrow part of the sort of waist, and I thought just highlighting the tips of these would add a little bit more contrast, a little bit of a gradient going on. It's just that they're a bit difficult to get to, and I don't know how much this will show when the model's finally assembled, because you see this area will be blocked by the tail, the sides will be blocked by the arms and so on, so it's a little extra. I don't actually know if it will make that much difference to the final look. Now luckily the rib cage on the torso, the exoskeleton here, actually has a lot of natural lines and ridges, which makes this step very, very easy, because all you have to do is just pick them out. So I'm doing the vertical lines, and then I'm just going around the edges of the innards that you can see. I'm leaving the innards dark, and then highlighting everything around them for maximum contrast. I'm taking this slowly, taking my time, trying to do it right, because obviously this area will definitely show when the model's put together. It will be just below the head, and it will be in roughly the focal area of the model, particularly just under the head. So I'm just taking a bit of extra care to get the lines just right and in all the right places. It did occur to me that maybe there should be lines going across the central bone in the middle of the ribcage, and I sort of thought about it once or twice and didn't actually go with it in the end, so I'm hoping it'll stand up without it. Now as we get around to the sides, I suppose I could get away with less highlighting here, as they will be largely under the arms, but there are also an awful lot of details, such as the flesh hook launchers and the edges of the, what I can only describe as ribs. So I'm just going to go over all of those bits, and then if they show, fantastic, they're fully highlighted. If they don't show once the model's assembled, we haven't really lost anything. Now as you can see, this bit narrows tremendously, so I'm having to be very careful about what angle I put the brush in and where I put the brush tip. So I'm a little bit hesitant when I'm going into these areas because I just don't want to get the wrong colour of paint in the wrong places and give me a lot of fixing and tidying up to do later. It's better to be this way rather than have to do a lot of extra work later on. Now, keen-eyed viewers will notice that at this point I normally do the tail of the model in its sub-assemblies, and this time I'm not doing so because I don't want the tail to be too vibrant compared to everything else. So I'm actually omitting this stage for the tail. I'm not going to do this colour on the tail at all. So instead I'm moving straight onto the head. Now, as the head will be a major focal point on the model because it includes the face and the eyes, I'm just taking a lot of care to highlight this area quite a lot. So there will be a lot of highlighting around the eyes, around the mouth, and particularly at the top of the head where it meets the carapace. Now, I'm just actually making a mistake here. I've gone too far into the darker colours, and so I've got some water on the brush and I just brush straight over the wet paint to disperse it. And then I can wipe that off, pick it up with the brush, wipe it on the tissue, do this a few times until the paint's gone and then it's back to the previous stage, and then I can pick up paint from the palette and try to paint that area again. This is something I don't always manage to capture on camera, but it's very quick and easy error correction provided you catch it quickly. You don't have many seconds to do anything about it. Before, one area that is rather important to do is the bit that will go right up against the edge of the carapace. It's not super obvious at the moment because there's a bit of overspill of the base colour on the carapace, but I'm going to paint the edges of this with the brightest colour, and then I'm going to go back later on and paint these plates completely black before adding the blue colours for Hive Fleet Behemoth to them, and that way you'll see this huge amount of contrast on top of the head and it will actually draw the eye. Just one little finishing touch to paint the bottom of the little craters on the side of the head. That's where they would naturally catch light, and same again on the other side. Now moving on to the sword arm. This is one of the easier pieces to pick out. I mentioned earlier that there was an element of edge highlighting here. On this arm, because there's so many raised edges, it's mostly actually edge highlighting at this stage, and then we use slightly darker colours to blend it all together later on. Now, when I say later on, it will not actually be in this video. I was putting the video together earlier and I found that it was adding up to an hour and 15 minutes from just 2 colours, so I decided to shorten it to about a half-hour video, and I think the second half's 40 or 45 minutes. And so it will actually be 2 separate videos showing the 2 separate colours, but I assure you we will get on to Evil Sun Scarlets just once I'm done with this Wild Rider Red stage. You will see me rotating the parts quite a lot, mainly to see what have I painted, what needs painting, what looks like it needs more or less attention. And this is something that you tend to do as a miniature painter, just try and find all of the angles and establish where you need to paint and where you don't need to. Another trick with the arms is to mainly just focus on the raised surfaces, because you don't actually want to wipe out the base colour, the wash and the previous highlights that you've already done. You've already spent quite a bit of time on these bits, so you don't want to destroy all the work that you've just done. Now, once we actually get onto the hands and fingers, it actually becomes a lot easier, because all you really need to highlight at this stage are the absolute peaks, so the knuckles, the joints, and the very tips of the fingers next to what will be the claws. Also, anywhere where you feel it would particularly catch the light, any raised lines, any lumps and bumps that are the uppermost surfaces. You don't have to go too crazy under the hand, because obviously that will be underneath where we think the light source is, but I'm just quickly highlighting all of those bits as well, just to be on the safe side. Moving swiftly on, we're doing the whip arm. This will sit below the sword arm, but still needs highlighting, particularly around any of the raised edges, and because it doesn't have a shoulder pad, it will also need a slight highlight on the top of the round shoulder. I didn't highlight the bits that these glue onto on the model, because I'm assuming this bit will be covering it up. Now, because this is a second edition Warhammer 40,000 Tyranid Hive Tyrant in metal, you'll find there are a number of quirks. One of the quirks is that this lower arm is much smoother than the arm above it and has far fewer lines to actually pick out, so you've got to use a bit of artistic license to say, oh, this bit's raised and that bit isn't, and then you've got to kind of paint it in to make it work. The only exception to that, of course, are these raised pieces around the elbow and around the wrist. That is a very obvious ridge to highlight. Everything else you have to kind of make up as you go along. But those bits at least give you some idea of where the highlight should be, and the rest tends to flow from that. I've made another mistake again, just a bit too much paint into the area of a recess, and I'm doing the same technique again. Lots of water on the brush, water it down, disperse it, and then wick it away and spread it out on the tissue. And that quickly gets rid of a mistake that otherwise would have been quite time consuming to fix. So now we're back with paint from the palette, very carefully trying to do that corner and the bottom of these spikes. This was a step that didn't exist on the arm above, and seems to be fairly consistent. The lower arms have spikes at the elbow and the upper arms generally do not on this model. So this is the raised area I was talking about earlier around the wrist. It's got this really pronounced ridge which goes all the way around both sides of the arm, so you do have to twist it around and get the brush in from every angle, but it's a really good point to key off where you can see this is going to be a highlight and then everything around it can be a little darker, so that you've got either a gradient if the colour builds up or contrast if it does not. Now this is one of the areas you've got to be careful with, because this, if you do it right, will make a build up towards the centre of the forearm, and obviously decided that there's a bit too much paint build up on the brush that's drying out, so I'll get some more. Move the model out of the way whilst I'm dragging the brush across with water so I don't spill anything on it. Get the mix just right and then return to building up a nice transparent layer to try and get that nice colour. Now the actual hands are just as they were on the previous arm that you can see in the bottom left hand corner. The hands are actually identical, so it's a case of highlighting the knuckles, highlighting any raised ridges, and then highlighting the fingertips where they meet the darkest base of the claws. Again, we're doing a very kind of general lighting effect on these, so we're doing both sides of the hands even if we think it might be in shadow. Just to be sure that if it is visible, it still has some kind of highlighting and shading on it. I don't know how well you can see it, but there is a kind of cutout section on the upper hand, which of course my thumb is just blocking, but I'm just painting around the edges of that as it would, the hand would be upright, so all of that would pretty much be catching the light. Moving on to the two arms holding the gun. Now obviously you skip the shoulder pad and the gun because we're just doing the red flesh at the moment, but same sort of idea as the previous arms. Pick out all of the raised areas. This one's a little bit more obvious as the orientation of the arm because the one is literally above the other on the model, and that's how they hold the gun. So you can assume the light is coming vaguely from above, but again we're going to highlight all the way around just in case, because there's no strong directional light on this model, or at least I'm assuming that there isn't, as if the model's just kind of standing around on a sunny day. Now again, the work order is as before, so I'll actually fully do the upper arm inside and out, so all the way around, do the upper part of it, the forearm and then the hand, and then I'll switch to the lower arm and do the lower arm in its entirety. It's just this same idea of the work order always being the same, and that way it's very hard to miss something out by accident. I'm taking my time here on 2 counts. Obviously I want to omit the dark area inside the elbow, which I'm regarding as kind of innards inside the exoskeleton, and I want it to be darker. And then also, it's hard to tell on the footage, but this upper arm has a tremendous number of very fine raised lines, and I just want to pick those out very carefully. I don't want to push the brush too hard and push it into the valley between 2 raised lines, because that'll be a mistake I'll have to correct. As ever, I'm using quite a light touch to pick these out, on the basis that I can always go over something that I've been over once, whereas if I'm really heavy-handed with it, it generally leads to error correction. So a light touch, carefully picking out the lines as best as I can, seems to be the way that works the best. Now, although it's hard to see as I'm doing the inner arm, there are a lot of interesting features on the inside of the arm where it seems like tubes are coming out into the gun. Now, I know that's deliberate on this model, but I'm picking some of them out just in case they end up being flesh coloured later on. If I end up painting over them with another colour for the gun, fair enough, but at least I haven't really lost anything, whereas if I left them bare and then had to come back with the flesh colours, it would be more work later on. Now, painting the hands again, but you'll notice I'm going along the lines on the side of the hand. This is because I'm absolutely sure that they're going to be vertical, so the upper side of each finger in theory is going to be where the light is coming from, and therefore should be highlighted. I did do a little bit of this on the whip arm, but not so much on the sword arm, which is actually going to have the hand horizontal. Now, it's not been a feature of many of my previous videos, but you have now seen me going to the pot of water and eliminating what was on the brush a number of times. This is something that I do periodically whilst painting. You can actually get paint drying on the brush, and you want to avoid this because it very quickly turns a good brush into a terrible brush. And whilst it can be recovered, I'd rather not use chemicals to break it down or brush soap too often on my brushes. Bear in mind this brush is over 20 years old, so I think I'm going the right way when it comes to brush care. Okay, so that was the upper arm done completely. I'm hoping you can tell the difference between that and the lower arm. So we're just making a start on the lower arm, painting it just as we did with the whip arm, starting with this kind of cutout in the upper arm. Again, it is partially in shadow of the upper arm, but I'm still going to paint it pretty much as if it wasn't. I'm not going for like a really, hyper realistic lighting effect or anything like that. And anything that naturally falls into shadow will actually be darkened by the shadow anyway, so I've generally found this to be the better approach. Now we are getting towards the end of this video. What I'm hoping to do is to have these 2 videos uploaded pretty close to one another in terms of, what day they're uploaded on. So there should be this video with the Wild Rider Red, followed in short order by a video featuring Evil Sun Scarlet, which follows on from this directly. That does mean that I'm going to have a number of videos that are focusing on the Hive Tyrant rather than going back to the Goliaths, because actually at this point the Tyranid Hive Tyrant needed much more work than catching up with the Goliaths. hoping as I pick out these details on particularly the forearm, you can start to see that there's that little bit more contrast, and you can see why it's worth going through this step. I hope that's actually been a theme throughout this video, but you particularly seem to notice it on this lower arm on the gun, where it's fairly low contrast until I pick out some of the lines and ridges with Wild Rider Red. Now this arm takes a bit less time than the upper arm because the forearm has very few ridges on it and there are no wires going into the arm, so it's pretty simple, a bit like the whip arm. And then it's just a case of doing this ridge by the wrist and then picking out the details on the actual hands themselves. I do apologise for having the block of wood in the way of the work that I'm doing. It's something I'm trying to improve as I make the videos, just trying to work out how to show the work to the camera and still actually be able to see what I'm doing without making major mistakes. It's a bit of a learning process. Same again with this hand, just highlighting each knuckle, each joint, and then a thin line across the top of each finger where hopefully it would catch the light, and then just a bright line at the end of each finger where it would meet the base of what would be claws. The claws will be painted completely black later on, so there will actually be high contrast there. Right, if you watched this far, first of all, thank you for watching. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If you liked it, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so you can get notifications about future videos. I hope they will be coming out soon.